Technically, the topic for this week is democracy and slavery. Democracy and slavery. However, in the following lecture video, and I think all my, at least the way I'm planning it out right now, all of my lecture videos I end up producing for this week aren't going to be directly related to democracy or slavery, although this topic relates to both democracy and slavery and touches on overlaps with lots of other topics. But basically, yeah, I thought I would eschew democracy and slavery and focus on the market revolution. So kind of the reason for that is I think Maclay focuses a lot on both democracy and slavery. Also, I've talked a lot about slavery in these lecture videos thus far, especially in I think the week one lecture videos. And I've touched on it, in other places. So the market revolution, the economics of the 19th century, the early to mid 19th century United States, the early republic and antebellum era, economic developments, technological developments. This stuff is really important. Maclay doesn't spend a lot of time on this. And so, yeah, I thought I would focus on this, right? So the market revolution during this time encompasses lots of different other is kind of a broad umbrella term for lots of other more specific revolutions, like the communications revolution, transportation revolution. You could say as well, probably you could identify other labor revolutions and other revolutions that are happening during this time in American history. So, and again, it's, focusing on the market revolution this week. It's naturally going to make its way into the topic of democracy, and more explicitly, I'm going to make my way a little bit later in this lecture into the topic of slavery, but from the perspective of changes in the marketplace, economic changes. Okay, so yeah, so let's get started. So first of all, on the other side of the screen, you can see a picture. This is, I'll just go ahead and read it. This is a depiction by William James Bennett, a view of South Street from Maiden Lane. This is basically New York City, circa 1827. So you can see it's becoming a bustling metropolis, right? Lots of people. This is a depiction of the New York City seaport, basically. So merchants are loading their ships with goods. Who knows where these goods are headed? All over the world, right? Connections with all of the world. Crowds of diverse population of people in the late 1820s. So here in New York City, diverse kinds of commerce, trade going on, commercial activities and development going on. So I thought that encapsulates pretty well kind of the topic here. Okay, so in the early 19th century, early years of the 19th century, I should say, Americans' endless commercial ambition. One Baltimore paper in 1815 referred to, quote, almost universal ambition to get forward, referring to this sort of market revolution. So this almost universal ambition to get forward really remade the nation. That's not an exaggeration. So between the Revolution and the Civil War, the American Revolution and the Civil War, an old subsistence world died and a new, more commercial nation was born. Americans integrated the technologies of the Industrial Revolution into a new commercial economy. Steam power, the technology that moved steamboats and railroads, fueled the rise of American industry by powering mills and sparking new transportation networks. A quote, market revolution remade the nation. So the revolution reverberated across the country. More and more farmers grew crops for profit, for example, as opposed to just growing to feed themselves and their families, right? Known as subsistence or self-sufficient production, subsistence farming, right? Vast factories and cities arose in the North. Enormous fortunes materialized. A new middle class ballooned. And as more men and women worked in the cash economy, they were freed from the bound dependence of servitude. So there were social, not just economic, but social and sort of hierarchical cultural implications to this economic revolution, this market, this technological revolution, which I'll get into. But there were costs to this revolution, of course, as well. There were drawbacks, there were undoubted negatives. As northern textile factories boomed, the demand for southern cotton swelled and American slavery accelerated. So I'm going to talk about this more in a few minutes, but there was a connection, a strong connection between the two different things here. So there's industrialization, urbanization, technological advancement, all these things that are happening in the North, which historians have focused on for a long time. There's what's happening in the South. So we're mainly talking about the antebellum period here. You could go back maybe to 1815 as well. So maybe 1815 or 1820 to about the Civil War, 1860. So that's what's happening in the North. In the South, there's sort of, you could call it slavery 2.0, right? So slavery 1.0 was tobacco, mostly tobacco and rice production in places like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, et cetera. And that's known as, at least retrospectively, as the Old South, right? So that's kind of the old way of doing a plantation cash crop economy. And the new shiny object is cotton, in beginning really around 1815, a little before that, but definitely going into the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. There's plantations are growing cotton, and this is concentrated mostly in not the upper South, but you could call it the lower South or deep South, states like Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia. And they are the main ones here. That was ground zero of the sort of cotton revolution. And so anyway, I'll talk more about that. But historians treated these two developments as mostly separate for a long time, right? They didn't see a whole lot of connection between them, right? So the growth of cotton-based slavery in the South and the growth of industry, manufacturing, the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, the sort of modern world, the modern economy in the North, they were seen as two separate things. But recently, historians have posited, I think pretty convincingly, that they were connected in many ways, right? They fed off each other. So I'll get into that. Okay, so excuse me. Northern subsistence farmers became laborers bound to the whims of markets and bosses. I'm picking it up with my sort of encapsulation of what happened in this period. Let's see, the market revolution sparked explosive economic growth and new personal wealth, but it also created a growing lower class of propertyless workers and a series of devastating depressions called panics. Yes, we're talking about the drawbacks of the market revolution. Yeah, so this is the beginning of the era of panic, starting with the Panic of 1819. There's a Panic of 1837. There's a Panic of 1857, just a few years before the Civil War. There's lots of postbellum panics going into the 20th century. And panics, yeah, this wasn't as much of a feature of American life prior to the emergence of the market revolution. And by the way, you could call this the rise of capitalism. I think capitalism in many ways overlaps with the market revolution. When people say market revolution, they're talking about capitalism, but you can break those two concepts apart to a certain extent. Inherently, as far as industrializing, right, you don't need capitalism necessarily to industrialize. That's the way that we industrialize. That's the way that Western Europe industrialized. That's not the way that Russia, for example, I'm getting a little bit outside of the time, very outside of our topic here, but Russia didn't industrialize via capitalism. They industrialized via Stalinist socialism. But anyway, capitalism and the market revolution in the United States in this context really go hand in hand for the most part. But there's negatives, there's drawbacks like panics, right? Economic depressions. Many Americans labored for low wages as well and became trapped in endless cycles of poverty. Some workers, often immigrant women, worked 13 hours a day, 6 days a week, right? Others labored in slavery. Massive northern textile mills turned southern cotton into cheap cloth. And although northern states washed their hands of slavery, the fact remained that they were connected, right? Their factories fueled the demand. The fact is that their factories fueled the demand for slave-grown southern cotton, and their banks provided the financing that ensured the profitability and continued existence of the American slave system. The two systems were connected, right? And so as the economy advanced, the market revolution wrenched the United States in new directions as it became a nation of free labor and slavery, of both free labor and slavery, of wealth and inequality as well, and of endless promise on the one hand, but also untold perils, negatives, drawbacks to this new system on the other. So let's get into some specifics here on the early republic, economic development in the early republic. Okay, so the growth of the American economy reshaped American life in the decades before the Civil War. Americans increasingly produced goods for sale, not for consumption, goods for sale, not just for consumption. Improved transportation enabled a larger exchange network as well. Labor-saving technology improved efficiency and enabled the separation of the public and domestic spheres. So that's getting into kind of the social implications of economic changes here, right? The market revolution fulfilled the revolutionary generation's expectations of progress, but introduced troubling new trends at the same time: class conflict, child labor, accelerating immigration, and the expansion of slavery followed in the market revolution's wake, you could say. These trends required new family arrangements and transformed American cities at the same time. Okay, so the market revolution was stimulated not just by events in the United States, but events outside of the United States, like the Napoleonic Wars, like what was happening in Europe during this time. Napoleonic Wars. Excuse me. American commerce had proceeded haltingly during the 18th century. American farmers increasingly exported foodstuffs to Europe as the French Revolutionary Wars, also known as the Napoleonic Wars. So we're talking about really, I guess, French Revolutionary Wars, that's about 1793 to about 1815, and Napoleon takes over right around 1800. But anyway, during this time, so the warfare was devastating Europe, and that was an opportunity for America, right? And economically. So America's exports rose in value during this time from 20 million at about 1790. That was the total value, estimated value of American exports, to an estimated 108 million. So that's what, a 5 or 6-fold increase by 1807, by the beginning of Jefferson's embargo, which I talked about previously. But while exports rose, exorbitant internal transportation costs hindered substantial economic development within the United States. In 1816, for instance, $9 could move 1 ton of goods across the Atlantic Ocean, but only 30 miles across land. Let's think about that for a second. So $9 would move your goods across the Atlantic Ocean in merchant's ship, right? Probably. But if you wanted to move it 30 miles, from Maryland to Virginia, for example, even just within the state of, upstate New York to New York City, that would cost you $9, right? That's pretty amazing. There's an inherent, I would say in general, this is kind of a general rule in history, transportation is more efficient and therefore costs less and is easier via water, whether you're talking about just populations moving, immigration, right, migration, or whether you're talking about shipping, goods, crops, manufactured goods, right? Water is better than land in general, right? Now, the modern world, I think, has changed this to a large extent, right? But you need this infrastructure, you need good roads, and railroads and better means of communication, and et cetera. And that's what needed to be built here, right? And that's what was built. Okay, so for example, an 1816 Senate committee report lamented that, quote, the price of land carriage is too great, end quote, to allow the profitable production of American manufacturers. But in the wake of the War of 1812, Americans actually rushed to build a new national infrastructure, new networks of canals and roads and railroads, which I'll talk more about. In his 1815 annual message to Congress, President James Madison stressed, quote, the great importance of establishing throughout our country the roads and canals which can best be executed under national authority. So this was, according to Madison and many others, a way of uniting the country, kind of literally and figuratively, right? Turning regional economies into a national economy, but you had to build this infrastructure. State governments continued to sponsor State governments continued to sponsor the greatest improvement in American transportation, but the federal government increasingly, around 1815, 1820 into the 1830s, the federal government's annual expenditures and internal improvements climbed to a yearly average of about 1.3 million by Andrew Jackson's presidency, starting in 1828. State legislatures, meanwhile, pumped capital into the economy by chartering banks. The number of state chartered banks skyrocketed from, there's actually only one bank upon American independence in 1783. That's, I believe, the Bank of North America, essentially founded by Robert Morris. So anyway, by 1820, there's 266 state charter banks. By 1840, there's 702. And then by 1860, at the dawn of the Civil War, there's 1371. That's the number of state charter banks. So banks are proliferating, right? So we're going into sort of approaching sort of a modern economy. So there's implications to all these banks, right? Which I'll get to. European capital also helped build American infrastructure. By 1844, one British traveler declared that, quote, "The prosperity of America, her railroads, canals, steam navigation, and banks are the fruit, fundamentally the fruit of English capital," unquote. So that kind of sums up that phenomenon, right? So this wasn't just about developments in America and moving money around in America. This was an international development that had implications in the early United States. Economic growth at the same time proceeded unevenly. Depressions devastated the economy in, as I mentioned before, 1819, the Panic of 1837, the Panic and Economic Depression of 1857. Each followed rampant speculation in various commodities. Land in 1819 was one of the primary causes. Land speculation was one of the primary causes of the Panic of 1819. Land and enslaved laborers, speculation in those commodities basically was the primary cause of the Panic of 1837, right? And then railroad bonds was speculation in railroad bonds was the problem in 1857. Eventually the bubbles all burst. The spread of paper currency also untethered the economy from the physical signifiers of wealth familiar to the previous colonial generation, right? Namely land. So you could be wealthy and rich. You could be on the make without owning a significant amount of land, really any land, right? That was a totally novel phenomenon at this time. Counterfeit bills were endemic during this early period of banking as well. With so many fake bills circulating, Americans were constantly on the lookout for the confidence man. That was a cliche. That was a common expression during this time, the confidence man, right? The swindler, the huckster, essentially, the fraud. The stank oil salesman, and other deceptive characters in the urban landscape. Prostitutes and con men could look like regular, honest Americans, after all, right? Advice literature offered young men and women strategies for avoiding hypocrisy in an attempt to restore the social fiber. So there was a perception that the social fabric of society was being torn asunder, right? Was being frayed, and to a certain extent being torn by the proliferation, the ascendancy and essentially proliferation of these business capitalist values, the profit motive, right? Making a profit at all costs, right? Values, I think, that we would refer to in a more contemporary time as capitalism, associated with capitalism, for better or for worse, right? Okay. Let's see. Intimacy in the domestic sphere became more important as duplicity proliferated in the public sphere. Fear of the confidence man, counterfeit bills, and a pending bust. Economic bust created anxiety in the new capitalist economy, not surprisingly. But Americans refused to blame the logic of their new commercial system for these depressions. Instead, they kept pushing, quote, to get forward, to go back to the quote that I started with. So encompassing this, market revolution, I guess what I've just been talking about, you could say is sort of a financial revolution. There was also, of course, a transportation revolution. This so-called transportation revolution opened the vast lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1810, even before the rapid explosion of American infrastructure. For example, Margaret Dwight left New Haven, Connecticut in a wagon headed for Ohio Territory. Her trip was less than 500 miles, but took 6 weeks to complete. To travel 500 miles. It took 6 weeks. The journey was a terrible ordeal. She's quoted as saying that the roads were, quote, so rocky and so gullied as to be almost impassable. 10 days into the journey at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Dwight said, quote, it appeared to me that what had come to an end of, that we had come to an end of the habitable part of the globe. I can't talk for some reason. Habitable, that's what I'm trying to say. That we had come to an end to the habitable part of the globe. So it's like the context that she was, the physical landscape that she was up against was almost uninhabitable, right? That was her impression, right? She finally concluded that, quote, the reason so few are willing to return from the Western country is not that the country is so good, but because the journey is so bad. And 18 years later, in 1829, English traveler Francis Trollope made the reverse journey across the Allegheny Mountains from Cincinnati to the East Coast. At Wheeling, Virginia, her coach encountered the National Road, the first federally funded interstate infrastructure project. The road was smooth, and her journey across the Alleghenies was very scenic, was a scenic delight, in fact, right? And she is said to have said, quote, is said to have remarked that, quote, I really can hardly conceive a higher enjoyment than a botanical tour among the Allegheny Mountains. The 90 miles of National Road were to her essentially a quote, a garden, end quote, right? That gives you kind of an idea, right? And if the 2 decades between Margaret Dwight's and Francis Trollope's journeys transformed the young nation, the pace of change only accelerated in the following years. The transportation revolution began with improved road networks and soon incorporated even greater improvements in the ways people and goods moved across the landscape. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the other aspects of infrastructure improvements, canals, and specifically the Erie Canal. So here's an artist's depiction of the Erie Canal at Lockport in 1839. This is the Erie Canal circa 1839. Here you go. There we go. So New York State completed the Erie Canal in 1825. The 350-mile long human-made waterway linked the Great Lakes with the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean. Soon crops grown in the Great Lakes region were carried by water to eastern cities, and goods from emerging eastern factories made the reverse journey to Midwestern farmers. The success of New York's, it was called an artificial river, and the success of this Erie Canal, this artificial river, launched a canal building boom. By 1840, Ohio created 2 navigable all-water links from Lake Erie to the Ohio River. And to give you an idea of what we're talking about here on a map, so yeah, the Erie Canal essentially connected Lake Erie, hence why it was called the Erie Canal, to the Hudson River on the right part of the picture. The Hudson River essentially flows into New York City and essentially the Atlantic Ocean, right? So that makes things much more connected, right? And this led to, among other things, the exponential growth of New York City as an economic power and therefore a center of society and culture and all kinds of other things. Another important development in this time period is the steam engine, and specifically the steamboat, right? So the steamboat was actually invented by the man pictured on the screen, by this guy, Robert Fulton, who established the first commercial steamboat service up and down the Hudson River in New York in 1807. Soon thereafter, steamboats filled the waters of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. The downstream only routes became watery 2-way highways pretty quickly. For example, by 1830, more than 200 steamboats moved up and down Western rivers. And yeah, that's a depiction of this phenomenon, steamboats moving. This is purported to be a depiction of just outside St. Louis, steamboats making their way both ways essentially a two-way water highway via the Mississippi River, circa 1859, right? The United States first long distance, the United States first long distance rail line launched from Maryland in 1827. Baltimore's city government and the state government of Maryland provided half the startup funds for the new Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, known as the B&O Railroad Company. So the B&O's founders imagined the line as a means to funnel the agricultural products of the Trans-Appalachian West to an outlet on the Chesapeake Bay. Similar motivations led citizens in Philadelphia, Boston, New York City, and even Charleston, South Carolina in the South to launch their own rail lines. State and local governments provided the means for the bulk of this initial wave of railroad construction, but economic collapse following the Panic of 1837 made governments weary of such investments. Government supports continued throughout the century, but really after the Panic of 1837 into the 1840s and 1850s, the public origins of railroads become much more privatized, and the public origins of railroads were really all but forgotten. And the Railroad Corporation became the most visible embodiment, really, of corporate capitalism in the United States as you get into the 1840s and 1850s and around the time of the Civil War. Yeah, so by 1860, Americans had laid more than 30,000 miles of railroads in total. The ensuing web of railroads and canals meant that few farmers in the Northeast or Midwest had trouble getting goods to urban markets. Railroad development was slower in the South, but there a combination of rail lines and navigable rivers meant that few cotton planters struggled to transport their products to textile mills in the Northeast and in England. Such internal improvements not only spread goods, they spread information. So the transportation revolution was followed by a communications revolution. Here I'm mostly referring to the telegraph, in large part referring to the telegraph. So the telegraph redefined the limits of human communication. By 1843, Samuel Morse had persuaded Congress to fund a 40-mile telegraph line stretching from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. Within a few short years, during the Mexican-American War, telegraph lines carried news of battlefield events to Eastern newspapers within days. The consequences of this transportation, along with this communication revolution, these revolutions reshaped the lives of Americans. Farmers who previously produced crops mostly for their own family now turned to the market in many cases. They earned cash for what they had previously consumed. They purchased the goods they had previously made or gone without. Market-based farmers soon accessed credit through Eastern banks as well, which provided them with the opportunity, for example, to expand their enterprise, their farming enterprises, right? Or branch out into other strictly agricultural enterprises, but also left them prone to the risk of catastrophic failure brought by distant market forces, right? So it's with opportunities come challenges and risks as well. In the Northeast and Midwest, where farm labor was ever in short supply, ambitious farmers invested in new technologies that promised to increase the productivity of the limited labor supply. The years between 1815 and 1850 witnessed an explosion of patents and agricultural technologies, right? The most famous of these, at least in this era, undoubtedly was Cyrus McCormick's horse-drawn mechanical reaper, which partially mechanized wheat harvesting, made wheat harvesting, which mostly took place in the North, more efficient and therefore more profitable. And also John Deere's steel-bladed plow, which more easily allowed for the conversion of unbroken ground into fertile farmland. Most visibly, the market revolution encouraged the growth of cities and reshaped the lives of urban workers. In 1820, only New York had over 100,000 inhabitants, but by 1850, 6 American cities had met that threshold, including Chicago, which had which had been founded only 2 decades earlier. Chicago was a brand new city. Now it had over 100,000 people. New technology and infrastructure paved the way for such growth, right? The Erie Canal, for example, captured the bulk of trade emerging from the Great Lakes region, securing, as I mentioned before, New York City's position as the nation's largest and most economically important city. The steamboat turned St. Louis and Cincinnati into centers of trade as well. And Chicago rose as it became essentially the railroad hub of the Western Great Lakes and Great Plains regions. The geographic center, excuse me, of the nation shifted westward as a result of these developments. The development of steam power and the exploitation of Pennsylvania coalfields, for example, shifted the locus of American manufacturing. So by the 1830s, New England was losing, as a result, was losing its competitive advantage with the West. Meanwhile, the cash economy eclipsed the old local informal systems of barter and trade. Income became the essential measure of economic growth. As a result of this, productivity and efficiencies paled before the measure of income, right? Income and wealth measured in the amount of money you amassed, right, was what mattered suddenly, right? That's a significant, important break with the past. Cash facilitated new impersonal economic relationships and formalized new means of production as well. Young workers might simply earn wages, for instance, rather than the old operating under the old system of receiving room and board in exchange for their services, or being trained as a part of apprentices, and as a part of an apprenticeship, I should say, being apprentices. So that kind of goes away, and you receive wages in cash, i.e. income, right? Moreover, a new form of economic organization appeared, the business corporation. That's hugely important in this era. And I think we're gonna pick it up there in video 2. So yeah, in video 2 here, I'm gonna continue talking about the market revolution. I'm gonna talk about the business corporation and get into how this all relates to slavery, changes in labor organization, and kind of go from there. So I'll see you in video 2.